And hello, my name is George Tolman. I am here to talk about the assessment, screening, and classification of emotional behavioral disorders. A little bit about me. I am currently a PhD candidate in special education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I will be finishing my PhD soon here, which would be really great. I have, before going back to academia, I was a school psychologist for 6 years, and I also served 1 year in an educational service unit in Western Nebraska supporting our MTSS initiative in the state. And I'm also currently a consultant for the special education department at the Nebraska Department of Education. And so I support multiple initiatives there and primarily work with our Nebraska MTSS work in that consulting role. So our purpose for today, again, is to look at those screening tools, the assessment measures, and those classification systems. Our primary focus will be on educational systems because most of the work that you'll be doing post degree is going to be working in an educational system, more than likely. So we're going to spend a lot of time on there and highlight some key features of some of the mental health systems, but nothing significant. That can be done at another time, and frankly, is its own presentation. And for the purpose of our presentation today, we were going to also be using the phrase emotional behavior disorder rather than emotional disturbance. And the reason why is because even though emotional disturbance is the formal wording under law, there is a lot of negative feelings about that phrase. And even though emotional behavior disorder still has some negativity behind it, and there's some very strong feelings about that in the field, we will use EBD rather than the emotional disturbance tag for our conversations. But just know that if you read this in the literature or if you're conversing with people, they are synonymous. They are typically the same thing. So important resources for you to have. The first is the technical assistance document on emotional disturbance from the state of Nebraska. So that has been recently revised. I believe it was a couple years ago now at the time of this presentation in 2023. So you can access that either via the link or access that through the Nebraska Department of Education website. It's also important, if you don't have your copy already or have a way to access it, to have the APA Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, now text revised, so TR, so DSM-5 TR, to have your copy of that text available. As most educational employees will tell you, you don't necessarily work with the DSM-5 that much because you're under a different verification guideline system. But a lot of the stuff is the same, and obviously having the DSM at your leisure helps you also understand other mental health problems and diagnoses as well when you are consulting with teachers or families. So to have that in your back pocket, if you will, is always nice. And then lastly is actually an article that I hope all of you get to read. It's not long at all, but it's from Dr. Tim Lewis out of the University of Missouri and a lot of other what I would call pioneers, at least modern day experts in school-based prevention, mental health, school-based prevention of behaviors, I should say, mental health supports, etc. And this is a great article that gives you a nice general look as to how school-wide positive behavior support systems, or PBIS, can help students with emotional behavioral disorders. And so if you read the technical assistance document, you read Dr. Lewis's document, you'll have a lot of resources already at your disposal, along with what's shared currently in your course text and also whatever we share in today's presentation. So before I go on, I have a couple of reflection questions that I would like for you to pause the video and think about before moving on. And so the first one is, when you read the term emotional disturbance, what comes to mind? What kind of feelings come up? What kind of emotions come up? From a definition standpoint, how would you define it? Number two, have you worked with students needing significant behavioral support? And if so, what did that look like? So your background might be a paraeducator. Your background might be a special educator seeking advanced degree, an advanced degree. You might be have some history in administration, or you might be someone doing a complete turnaround from another field to education. But what have you experienced in terms of your work with treating students with significant behavioral needs? And then lastly, reflect on your school's current process and practices if you're in a school right now that deal with significant behavioral needs. And do you think that those supports are sufficient? Why or why not? So again, take a little bit of time. No need to take hours on end, obviously, but maybe take 3 to 5 minutes. Pause this video right now and answer these questions to get you going in terms of what we're going to talk about for our rest of the time together. So remember that when we deal with special education eligibility, which is the primary form of eligibility in terms of a mental health diagnosis that educators do, there are 3 questions. Number 1, is there a disability as defined by the criteria established by the state? Number 2, does that disability adversely affect the student's educational performance? And then number 3, if the student demonstrates a need, or excuse me, if the demonstrate meets the first 2 criteria, does that student demonstrate the need then for special education services? So if you answer all these questions with a yes, then the student is eligible to receive special education services. It's important to remember that because in other states, they do not have all 3 of these criteria. Typically, it's the first 2. In Nebraska, we consider the 3rd question very distinctly because there might be a situation where you do meet a disability as defined by the criteria of the state of Nebraska, and it does adversely affect the student's educational performance, but you may not need special education. Things like a Section 504 plan or formal accommodations in another way may be enough, and the student may not need special education. But for our purposes, not to get into the weeds of that conversation, just remember that in order to qualify for any disability under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, you must answer, at least in the state of Nebraska, all 3 of these questions with a yes. So reviewing the federal definition, this is exactly from the federal website, and you can look it up yourself. This is the definition for emotional disturbance. So it's a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time and to a marked degree that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And then there are 5 specific areas. An inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. Inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. A general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. And then 5th, or E in this case, a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. Emotional disturbance does include schizophrenia. So if a student has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you can, by law, consider that an emotional disturbance. Schizophrenia is not its own disability category under IDEA, but it does fit under this umbrella. And just know that this term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless they have an emotional disturbance as defined by what we have right here. So we won't get into the social maladjustment piece significantly here because of the purpose of our talk. But one thing that I would encourage you to do is to look up what does socially maladjusted mean compared to emotional disturbance or emotional behavioral disorder. And there's not a great debate, but I would say it's well talked about right now and has been for a while for those who are concerned about where's the line between emotional disturbance and social maladjustment. Again, we won't get into that here for the purpose of our conversation, but it is something to think about in the future because sometimes that line does get blurred more often than not. So in the Nebraska definition, it's not all that different. In fact, it's very much the same thing. The only thing that's particular about Nebraska's definition, and it's the same across most states that I've come across as well, is that In order to meet the category of emotional disturbance, a child must have a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics. So this is where it gets to the eligibility piece. To meet the criteria for emotional disturbance, you do not need to meet all 5 of these criteria. You only need to meet one of them. So that's very important. In schools, and write this down, note that you can have multiple subcategories of emotional disturbance be listed, but at the end of the day, we just identify the student with emotional disturbance. Pinning out or specifying which of these bullet points is relevant to the child helps with us for intervention. Be sure to capture that. But in terms of, does it change how many services we give, and does more mean better? No, none of that. If you meet one of the criteria, meet the definition for emotional disturbance, assuming that it's also adversing your education and you need special education services. That should give you the rights to have an IEP, which then drives intervention, which hopefully is targeted around remediating whatever we found in terms of these bullet points. So again, let's say we have a student that meets 3 of the 5 criteria and another student that only meets criteria 4, a general pervasive mood or unhappiness of depression. Both students would meet the definition for emotional disturbance, assuming that, again, it adversely impacts their educational performance and they require special education services. They would be essentially qualified to be able to get an IEP. But again, our intervention will look different, because when you look at these bullet points, if you have a student who has a pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, do you really want to treat them from an intervention standpoint the same as someone who, let's say, demonstrates inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances? They might overlap, they may not. So again, in terms of specifying where the student fits, helps more with intervention than it does, again, do we get more services if there's more bullet points met? That is a no. That is a no. Once you meet emotional disturbance, you meet emotional disturbance. But again, in terms of intervention, that's where we might pad some of our supports, because it's important that we meet the student's needs. And sometimes that does mean that if the student meets multiple criteria, that may mean they need more support, but not necessarily all the time. I already said this in the previous slide, but I do want to offer you a reflection question again. Take a pause here, and I'd like for you to talk about it. Is, what does that phrase "long period of time and to a marked degree" mean? And again, that emphasis is mine, that bulleted or that bolded "and," but it is important. It's not "or," it's an "and." So the behaviors must exist over a long period, and then also to a marked degree. It's also, you can say, it adversely affects their education in a way that if it was removed or mitigated, it wouldn't affect it as much. So that's very, very important. Also know that if you're working with young children, the verification of EBD can be used for children under the age of 5. I will caution very strongly, though, that if you decide to go that route, you want to be sure the data is very conclusive. There's a lot of extraneous variables with early childhood that could come into play, and you just don't want to put a tag on a student that, again, is a very impactful one. And so you want to be sure you do your due diligence, and your team does the due diligence there as well. But again, my reflection question to you is, what does long period of time and to a marked degree mean? And think about, what kind of issues does that have if someone on the team says, well, I think that this is what long period of time means and what a marked degree is, and is different than yours. So again, pause the video right now and take a gander at this question. What does long period of time into a marked degree mean? One thing that I want to emphasize, that there's a very good chance that you're not going to be directly involved in terms of the actual identification and verification piece. You're going to do that with a team, with a school psychologist or a social worker or other individuals on your school staff. But it's important to remember what the criteria is to provide a game plan to determine what data must be collected to meet the eligibility guidelines. Again, you don't pigeonhole the student and say, I think you have EBD, so now this is what I'm going to do. in the most professional way and best practice way is you think about, hey, I'm starting to see some of these behaviors. This child could meet this criteria. So what are the minimum data points that I need to look at to be sure that my hypothesis is, could be um, uh, true or not? And so that's why understanding the criteria is important. You just don't want to go into it saying, oh, EBD means this, and then doing your own little thing. Know the criteria, know what's being asked, and then that will help in terms of the stuff you need to collect. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. The reason why we want a game plan is because evaluations are time consuming. So prioritizing what data is collected becomes very important. When you have a caseload of 50, 20, 25 students, as some of you already know, or if you're in a position of consulting with a school and supporting a district with students with these kinds of behavioral issues, these are not easy evaluations. In fact, they're fairly not only are they time consuming, but they're also energy draining in sometimes. So you want to be sure you prioritize what data is collected so you don't miss out on important data, but you also maybe mitigate the opportunities to collect data that may not be as meaningful. Especially with EBD, cultural competency and awareness is imperative. I use the phrase imperative intentionally. So you want to be very, very sure that at the end of the day, you are thinking about the student's ethnic, racial background. You're talking to the parents and the guardian, and you're trying to figure out what's the best way to support this student. Without that cultural competency, you might, even if it's unconscious, tag a EBD tag just because they didn't meet a social definition. So you want to be sure you're very, very careful with that. And honestly, cultural competency is even its own presentation. But for now, if you have that in your books, if you have that in your references, be sure to highlight that chapter, whatever it is, because you really need to know that, especially for EBD verification. Lastly, EBD is a very emotionally charged topic, so be respectful, considerate, and listen. My quote at the bottom is something that I would always talk about when I was consulting with schools, or if I was a school psychologist myself at the time, that I'd be talking to the personnel and going, remember, what parent likes hearing their child be talked about as a bad kid? And so we would prep ourselves and say we're going to intentionally desire to be positive and use our critical or our critical feedback, if you will, as a means to be able to leverage how to help the students succeed. And we would do our best to not emphasize the bad kid storyline, which is easily discussed far too often in a lot of conversations like this. Again, folks, the position that I hope that all of you take as professionals is that even though it's easy to point the finger at the student in a lot of ways, to always remember that there's some hope, that their dignity needs to be valued, and that because of that, when we're in these conversations, being respectful, consider and listen, because it is going to be emotionally charged. We're not going to go through all of these components because that's going to happen a little bit later, but in some, based on the Nebraska guideline document, which is going to be your primary document, or again, if you're working in another state, there's a good chance that these components are also going to be part of your criteria as well. There needs to be a direct observation of the student's behavior. There also needs to be indirect measures of behavior, which are like checklists, rating scales, those things. We need developmental data, so that typically comes from family history and also some other key indicators that we can get from the student's file. Setting analysis, so functional behavior assessment is something here that comes to mind. Again, what do certain environments and teacher prompts and responses, what does that do to either increase or decrease the behaviors that we consider are problematic? As needed, psychoeducational data, which is IQ testing, achievement testing, know that that is not a complete requirement for ED. We do need something to capture that IQ is at least above a certain threshold in some areas, but know that this testing is primarily up to the school psychologist, and so refer to them if wanting questions about that. We want to look at your intervention outcomes, the learning outcome data from the students, so like grades, Again, how are they doing in different interventions, and then any other relevant student data that is necessary. So there's a lot of data to collect. A lot of it is already there because of some of the process that we have in schools, but just know that these are the things necessary. And there's other things too, as well. But these are the main bulk of things you need to make a good decision regarding a student's eligibility in the area of EBD. I cannot overemphasize this point of the importance of collaboration. So every special education evaluation needs to include multiple stakeholders. I would embrace your school psychologist, your counselors, your social workers, or any other mental health personnel, because again, these cases are not easy, and having a lot of expertise at the table that is desiring the goodwill for the kid is really important. And always remember to include families in the discussion. This is not a unilateral decision from the school. In fact, that's an illegal thing to do under a special education law. So always include the families, always have open conversations with them. Conversations might be tough, but nonetheless, always include the families because that plays an important role in helping the student be successful. Here is another set of reflection questions. So again, take a quick gander at these and hit the pause button. So the first one is, based on your experience, what does that process look like for determining EBD in students? Do you think your staff are prepared and equipped to teach students with EBD, and explain why or why not? And then lastly, what kind of community supports exist to support students with EBD? So again, take a chance to look at these 3 questions and hit the pause button and reflect on that before moving forward in our presentation. So now let's get into some specifics regarding screening, assessment, and classification. So we're going to be looking at screening, and the first thing I want to emphasize is, why do we screen? Why do we have screening data? This is something that gets lost in a lot of conversations most of the time, even in academics, where screening has kind of its home, if you will. We ask, why do we need to screen? Why do we need to do this assessment 3 times a year? And in the traditional approach of any kind of special education eligibility, assessment was very heavy. So in other words, a lot of special education evaluations included a full gauntlet of assessments, the student removed from the classroom, often done in silos, meaning that people weren't talking to each other. It was basically held to a few people that knew what they were doing, and everyone else kind of got along with it. And frankly, it was a very reactive process, which we define as a wait to fail kind of model. Very unfortunate that that's how things have been for quite a long time. And the contemporary version, which is the one that I am all for, which is what I'm going to share with you, is that it's a balanced data collection approach. So we take every data source that's relevant, whether it be stuff we get from school itself or the new stuff that we need to do, like checklist, IQ assessment, those things. And there's frequent collaboration among stakeholders, including the families. The conversation is very, it goes back and forth quite a bit. And it's a very proactive process, meaning that we quote unquote do something about it. So just know that for our purposes today, we're going to be talking about that contemporary form of what that looks like. But I will forewarn you that the traditional model still exists, and it is still widely used in some areas in Nebraska and also throughout the country. So I'm not saying the traditional model is bad, as it's objectionably bad, but I will say that I don't think it is as good of an approach as what we currently teach, which is more of that contemporary, hey, we're going to be more balanced in our assessment. We're going to be talking to a lot of different people, and we're also going to be very proactive in supporting the student compared to maybe traditional approaches. So just as a heads up, know that that's my personal bias, for lack of a better phrase, of going into our discussion, is that we're going to be looking, and everything I talk about is going to be based on a contemporary basis. So general screening guidelines. So a screening process in sum is something very quick that has a little bit of reliability and validity for us to be able to confidently, with database decision-making, move students to intervention as they need it. So some general screening guidelines is that the measures are age appropriate, they are culturally sensitive, they are efficient. So these screeners shouldn't take forever to take. It should be relatively easy based on other assessments that are out there. So anything past 15, 20 minutes of administration, whether it be the students doing it themselves or someone measuring student behavior, is probably a little bit too much for a screener. It's got to be systematic, meaning that it works within the context of your educational system, and it must be interpreted appropriately. I say that very intentionally because some people mistakenly believe that screening data equates assessment data, and that is not true. So when you're screening for behaviors and students who may need more support, you are essentially doing a quick data gathering technique, for lack of a better term. And you're using that to then drive the necessity of intervention, which is really important with screening. There are two approaches to behavioral screening. So for those that are familiar with this in the academic realm, particularly, we have more of a formal process of screening. So think of like Dibbles, Ames, Webb, FastBridge, if you're using that. Those are formal academic pieces that we typically use in schools in Nebraska because of the dyslexia legislation that is now fully in force. Screening is imperative at specific grades in reading. So the same principles apply, except it's on behavior. Now, but again, there's two different viewpoints we can take. The first one is what we call systems level approach, meaning that this is data that we can easily access. So grades, attendance, positive behavior indicators, etc. And decision rules are typically created by school and relative to local needs. They're not empirically standardized compared to like other formal assessment days, which we'll get into a little bit. And in most cases, with the systems level approach, these are not specific to a particular behavior in most cases. So on the student level side, we have is a formal screening tool, typically, that is empirically validated, which means that I can go back and look at the research done to verify and that or validate that this is a empirical tool. The decision rules regarding if a student needs or doesn't need intervention are based on the tool itself. It's not typically decided by the local school community. And typically, these are to a specific type of behavior. So we'll have screeners for depression, we'll have screeners for externalizing behaviors, but nonetheless, they are specific to a type of or pattern of behavior compared to a systems level approach where it's more broad in scope. And really, we're just aiming to provide intervention to students who demonstrate need, whereas student level is much more specific. So a few documents that are important for you to have based on our presentation. I have two guidance or I should say I have one guidance document, two specific screeners, and then kind of a general tool of behavioral screener. So the very first document, the guidelines for using discipline referrals as a behavioral screener, is a nice document to help understand if you're using that systems level approach, how discipline referrals can play into that, and in doing so being equitable about that conversation. The social, academic, and behavioral screener, the SABRS, is from the FastBridge suite of assessments, and it's used here in Nebraska quite a bit. You might have a district that you're working with or are currently in that uses that. You can click on that link and it'll give you to the main website, and you'll be able to look at some of the resources that they have. The social skills rating system is something also that's used as well, that helps with screening potential behaviors related to EBD. It's not a direct measure of EBD, but nonetheless, it's something that you can use. And then I have a general document there looking at screening tools systematically, and that has a bunch of different universal behavior screeners that you can look at. So what I would like for you to do is take a look, especially at the first document, and maybe scan that systematic screening tools and really get a feel for what these screeners are. They'll help you in your learning going forward with this course. As I've mentioned before, screening by itself is not sufficient to verify or diagnose a student with an emotional behavioral disorder, period. End of story. If anyone uses a screener and says this student has EBD, you do not, you say, thank you for telling me, but you don't put too much weight into that decision or in that belief, because EBD is much more complex than just what a screener can tell you. The biggest piece about screening is that it should be used to identify students needing additional support, meaning that screening should lead to intervention. If you do not screen, or if you do not provide intervention in a reasonable time, after screening, then technically, as I put in my quote at the bottom, screening without action is not a good screening process. You might have collected the data, but it means nothing. Okay. So you want to be sure that if a student is found needing additional support, that the school should provide that support in a timely manner. And if the school is not providing the support, then the question becomes, why are you screening in the first place? So now the assessment of EBD. It's really pretty straightforward, but going back to that evaluation component slide, you can go back and refer to that in terms of some of the things you need. I'm going to explain these in just a little bit more detail with a specific observation matrix. So one of the most important things about EBD is that people need to be observing the student in the classroom to recognize why the behavior exists, how it's manifesting, and what to do about it. So one way to do that is using direct observation and doing it in multiple settings. Primarily, you look at the situations where the student is having difficulty, and it might be multiple settings, it might be one, and also you look at the settings where the student's doing really well in. So you can get a nice balance between, all right, am I looking at something, really universal, or am I looking something that's more specific in scope? And I provided the ISO riot matrix, which is something that we'll talk about here in a little bit, as a way to help with that observation kind of framework. Indirect measures of behavior are typically also used. In fact, I've never done a EBD verification without using indirect measures like checklist rating scales. So be sure to capture that as you move forward. Psychoeducational assessment, IQ achievement testing is not necessary, but are typically included to rule out other remedial causes like a learning disability, intellectual disability, those things. So just know that those are not necessarily required, but again, it's important to have them, which is why a lot of school psychologists still conduct them just to be on the safe side, to be sure it's a thorough evaluation. And interviewing the parents, guardians, and the student if possible. I've always had a lot of fun interviewing the students. Due to time constraints, interviews may not happen, but in a good world, you would want to always strive to include the parent in the conversation and not just when the meeting happens. So the ISO riot matrix, if you would click the link, it shows the 4 areas where you can collect data from: instruction, curriculum, environment, and the learner, so the student. And then the riot is what that looks like from reviewing previous data, what interviewing looks like, what observing should look like, and then actually testing it. So in a good general framework, you would look at a student's issues that at least that from what the team has said and other concerns, and you would ask yourself, all right, from instruction, curriculum, environment, and the learner itself, what information do I need to review? What do I need to interview for, if necessary? What do I need to observe for, which is definitely necessary for EBD verification? And then what do I need to test? So it just gives a nice general framework. And again, the resources on there for you to look at. I would encourage you to have this ISO riot matrix in your back pocket, because it's just a nice way of thinking through when you're game planning, like we talked about earlier, what that looks like. And I really do believe that that's a really good resource. And I still use it even today when I'm consulting with schools. When they ask me a question, I will think through, all right, did they review the data? Did they observe it? Did they do proper interviews, or do they need a test for it? And we would talk about that in those different environments of instruction, curriculum, the general environment itself, and then the student. To help you know what these EBD assessments look like, I listed a few in particular that I think are very relevant. So the Scales of Assessing Emotional Disturbance, 3rd edition, literally measures EBD. So that's one that I actually came across later in my school psych career. A school psychologist from California actually referenced that to me, and I've been recommending it ever since, because it really does cover all of the main indicators really well. The Behavior Assessment System for Children, the BASC, is also something you may want to look at, which is a lot of schools use. The Beck Anxiety Inventory is a little bit older, but it does exist. And I think there's some other versions out there that are maybe a little bit better than that. And then the CDI2, the Children's Depression Inventory, second edition. These are examples of EBD assessments. There are many more out there, but the purpose of this slide is to give you access and also to give you some exposure to these common assessments that you can see what they look like and how to use them. So, reflection questions. What type of screening or assessment measures exist at your school? And if you don't know what those are, who can you contact to figure that out? Take one of the assessment links in the previous page and then thoroughly read through its description. What unique features does the assessment have? Is it user-friendly? Do a critique of it. Does it require significant knowledge in assessment practices? What you're going to find is a balancing act between something that's really strong and also what your people are capable of using. And so sometimes the fanciest tool is not what you're going to use for the assessment. Sometimes it's going to be something a little bit easier. But reflect on that in terms, and again, think of pick one of those links and see what you think about it. And then number 3, look at each of the EBD criteria and think about the types of observation that need to be done in order to reasonably conclude a student exhibits EBD in one or more of those areas. So again, take a look at the EBD criteria and think about, all right, what does a pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression look like? And then what kind of observation would you be trying to capture, behaviors in particular, in order to help capture that bullet point? So again, take a little bit of time, if you would, of taking a look at these reflection questions before you move on to the last part of our presentation. And the last part, which is classification of EBD, which is really simple from an educational standpoint. So again, going back, these are the essential questions for any disability, relates to EBD as well. But you need to ask, does a student have EBD as defined by the criteria established by the state? If you're in Nebraska, that's where the Nebraska TA document comes in handy. If you're living in Iowa or Kansas or whatever state, you would need to look at whatever state criteria there are. But I promise you, it's going to be literally 95% the same. If there is a defined disability, does that disability adversely affect the student's educational performance? And if it does, so you said yes to the first 2, then does the student demonstrate a need for special education services? And if all 3 of those are met, the student meets the criteria for special education under the verification title of EBD. So what generally happens is that, again, this is not done alone. This is done with a team of individuals, including the parent, and as appropriate, the student. But all data is used in the evaluation area. Relevant data should be considered. And remember that multiple data points are needed, which is why I gave you a full list of things to consider. If you use only one data point to define EBD, you will be in trouble under the law. It's a very insufficient evaluation from that perspective. My reminders, which are more so my own suggestions over the years that I've worked and consulted, always have a people first approach to classification. So it's always student with a disability, never a disabled student. And the reason why we use that language intentionally is because, again, we still value the dignity and integrity of that student and the character of that student. And a disability does not define them. It just identifies where we need to support them. There's a big difference. Again, I mentioned using one data point is inefficient. You must have multiple data sources. I cannot emphasize that enough. And then lastly, it's a team decision, and eligibility is never done unilaterally. So it's always done within a team. It cannot be done individually, and always to remember that, especially in very difficult cases where you have a student that doesn't meet the criteria for EBD, and there's a lot of problem behaviors, and you're trying to find the best way to make it happen in the school system. It is very difficult, but again, it is a team decision, not just someone saying, I think that kid has ED, get him in special ed. That's illegal when that happens. By the way, here's the criteria. Again, it can be in one or more of the following areas, but again, all you need is to fit one of these criteria. And so once you have the data, and let's say that you've used direct observation and realize the student is really having a tough time making friends, really has inappropriate conversations with teachers, really struggles with words and phrases, you do a BASC, the behavior assessment system for children, and you realize they have a lot of inattention, some hyperactivity in there as well. let's also say you do the EBD assessment and they identify number 2 here, the second bullet point, as one of the strongest areas of need. And after interviewing, you realize, and you interview the parent, you interview the student, and they're saying, yeah, just really having a tough time keeping those interpersonal relationships appropriate and strong. You may have met criteria. But again, you only need to meet one of the criteria. You don't need to meet all 5. So if a student displays multiple bullet points, then again, that might change how you intervene for the student, but it doesn't mean that the EBD is, more bullet points qualified means more services. That doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, as I promised at the beginning, we'll have a brief discussion on mental health classification of EBD. So in mental health in general, there is a different classification system as a whole. So EBD actually is an umbrella that encompasses a bunch of different specific behavioral disorders, and it's all based on the DSM guidelines. So a mental health diagnosis does not guarantee EBD verification. So remember that EBD can only be verified using state and federal procedures. But a mental health diagnosis should always, 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 emphasis mine, always be considered in any special education evaluation and not intentionally ignored. Sometimes people don't take that mental health background into consideration and ignore it, and that's a big boo-boo on the school's part. Do not do that in your future. So again, mental health diagnosis does not automatically mean a gateway into special education, but the mental health diagnosis does mean that, hey, there's something there that maybe we should consider if we're seeing an adverse performance in educational data on the student. And also know that with mental health classification, that is based on the provider, the state licensing requirements, and other factors. So in education, EBD is defined under what the state of Nebraska has defined under its legal structure. In mental health classification in Nebraska, it's a little different. They are not bound. If you go to a counselor or a therapist, for instance, that's not in an educational setting, they are not bound to the educational law, but they are bound to the guidelines as has provided to them from the state of Nebraska. And in fact, when you go to different states, classifying certain types of mental health disorders actually changes per state. And you want to be sure you're watching that. So again, it is its own beast to talk about it, but this gives you a highlight into what's relevant for educational purposes. Again, if someone comes into a school system with a mental health classification, that does not mean you ignore it. You take the information and then you use it to leverage, hey, does this student meet EBD based on the history that we know and the current data that we have? So neglecting the mental health information may be very harmful. It must always be included. And I promise you that that's the better, best practice approach to take and the safest route compared to trying to ignore the previous mental health diagnoses. So in summary, EBD requires a thorough evaluation for multiple school personnel using adequate tools and resources. Screening is primarily used to help identify students that need intervention. Again, screening does not mean that you qualify for services. Screening means that we're going to help you with your demonstrated needs. Strong evaluation processes will include relevant history, current data, and evaluation data. And EBD does not define the student's strengths or identity. So always supporting the students and their families by embracing strengths and recognizing positive accomplishments is an important philosophy and practice to go. I will say that with students of EBD, sometimes it's very difficult to find those strengths, but you need to find them anyway, because every individual has a strength or a contribution that needs to be recognized. I promise you, if you follow that last bullet point, 80% of your issues related to some of the more significant EBD verifications and supports that you're going to be dealing with can be solved adequately if you just remember that last bullet point. So consider that a pro tip, for lack of a better phrase. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask your instructor, and also you can reach out to me. I'll have my email or contact information somewhere if you really wanted to know my thoughts on something else. I'm happy to support you. But this is the conclusion of our EBD talk, and so again, I hope that you learned something a little bit new or reinforced some things that you've already learned from other sources. And I wish you the best going forward. So again, My name is George Toman. I thank you so much for letting me get to share this information with you. And feel free to reach out if you need to. Take care. Bye bye.